The St. Joe River Basin Commission is technically an agency of the state of Indiana. It was created in the late 80s to address water quality concerns. The origin story starts something like the state of Michigan and the state of Indiana had come together to work on fish passage, bringing salmon and steelhead up from Lake Michigan all the way into almost Elkhart County. And there was a lot of energy around promoting the entire watershed as a destination for fishing. We've got 15 counties in the basin, 7 in Indiana, 8 in Michigan. And everybody's really excited because the fisheries report came out and said this is the place to go fishing, whether you're on a lake or whether you're going to go fishing on the river. We're going to get these big fish that everybody really likes to hunt for. We're going to get them all the way to St. Joe County. And about that time, the state of Indiana, as well as local health departments, realized that the St. Joe River was not meeting water quality standards for body contact. So a lot of concern around promoting this as a resource when we're also cautioning people to not come in contact with it. There had been a couple other river basin commissions established by the state of Indiana for different purposes, and the folks here locally in this area said, we need to do something like that, but with water quality as its focus. Try and address bacteria pathogen concerns, other pollutants, and hence, I should say, the St. Joe River Basin was formed, late 80s. The commission itself consists of members from each of the 6 participating counties in Indiana, and many folks who are here today serve on that commission, whether as a statutory member or as a proxy representative for someone else. But those members are, from each county, the mayor of the largest city or the executive of a county that doesn't have a city officially. So LaGrange County, for example, is the town of LaGrange, and Jeff Moore's here from the town of LaGrange. You have the health officer from each of the 6 counties in the basin. And you also have a county commissioner from each of the 6 counties. Sorry, I just blanked on that. So we have a health officer, a county commissioner, and the mayor. Now, in St. Joe County in particular, we actually have 2 Class 3 cities. So St. Joe County has 2 city representatives, Mishawaka and South Bend. So that's who serves on the commission, but just the 6 counties in Indiana. However, the statute explicitly mentions working together with Michigan, working towards some kind of bi-state cooperative agreement. And the mission is basin-wide, but the governance and the funding comes from the Indiana side of the basin. We have a pretty good representation here today, although we did skew a little bit toward the Indiana side. Last year, we had almost an even split between Michigan and Indiana. This year, it's more like 70-30, 70% of our folks from Indiana and 30% from Michigan. A lot of folks from the east end of the basin, as you can imagine. St. Joe County, Indiana is very well represented here today. When I last checked yesterday, we were supposed to have someone from every single county in the basin except for 2. We didn't get anybody from Hillsdale, which we almost never do. And this year it was Branch County we didn't have anybody from. But we had at least 1 member from every other county in the basin on the registration list. So that's exciting to see, and I really hope that the event today can be useful for you all. I want to talk a little bit about our current efforts, what we're working on, how we provide value to the county, and I'm going to start by talking about advocacy. So it's kind of unusual for a state agency to actually have the statutory authority to advocate on behalf of the river basin. And I'm lucky enough to, I got to go the last 3 years out to Washington, D.C. and talk to our legislators about a couple of things. Funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is used by some of our partners to do great things. The city of Elkhart has a dam removal project that's largely being funded by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And every year that comes up on the budget being chopped. And we have to go out there and advocate to still fund that program because it's doing important work. We also advocate for the state revolving funds for drinking water and wastewater infrastructure, which is used by many of our cities. It's low interest loans. And so that's a really important funding source that, again, is always cut, and we got to go advocate to get it pushed back. And then the last one is the USDA Farm Bill conservation programs. We've got a lot of folks, I think about 25-30% of the people that were registered for the event today work with NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, or Soil and Water Conservation Districts. And these folks depend on these USDA conservation programs to help landowners better utilize their land and conserve soil and water. So we advocate for all those, and the good news was this year it seemed to be effective. We got the numbers back up to where they had been, which is what we were shooting for, and so that sort of advocacy piece is important. But it's not just out in D.C., it's also at the state of Indiana. So I was down in Indianapolis a couple times this year, and I was fortunate to be able to have sort of a pulse on some things that were going on locally. One was the MS4. There was a bill around, I said MS4, which is an acronym. This is stormwater regulation stuff, and there was a bill that had come up in the Indiana State House to take away home rule, basically, not allow a local municipality to have rules about stormwater that went beyond the state, what the state would do. And so there was some concern about that locally, and we went down to Indianapolis and talked to folks and said, look, this is really important for us to be able to maintain ownership of this locally. And another one was around well and septic ordinances. So we're able to advocate for you folks who work at the city or work at the county, and that's, I think, an important role that we do. So we've done a lot of advocacy work. The other role we have that I'm going to mention today is monitoring, trying to have a pulse on the health of the river and the watershed. We've done a lot of water quality sampling in the past. We completed phase 3 of a sampling project. But then this year we're also getting into some flow monitoring, which will come in today when we talk about it, but helping to sponsor some USGS stream flow gauges that had lost their funding, were important to local community, and so the River Basin Commission has stepped in to try and help keep those things online, keep that data coming in. So monitoring is a big one, and the last one that I'll mention today is technical assistance. So I've found, I've been getting out and about lot over the last year. This is just, like I said, my second year doing this, and over the last year I have been to countless county commission meetings, stormwater boards, county council soil and water district boards, and what I found is by being there, you learn about the issues that are going on, and I'm able to provide some data, some information sometimes that I'm aware of that folks may not otherwise have access to. And so I think that there is an important role for the River Basin Commission to serve as a technical advisor on many things for local governments who may not have access to things. So those are sort of the big three that I'll mention that we've done over the last year. And something else that I want to tell you, because I was looking over what I talked about last year, and it was my first one, and I was really excited, but I was really concerned about funding for the River Basin Commission. And in fact, last year, we've got a lot of folks today who, when they introduced themselves, mentioned the Friends of the St. Joe River, which is a group I've been affiliated with for a really long time. And last year, we asked them to help sponsor the meals at this event because had some real concerns about the sustainability of the River Basin Commission to be able to implement the kind of programs that it was implementing. And so I really made a big push going out to all those counties and pointing to the statute that says the counties may appropriate money based on the land area that's in the basin. And when I first did it, I know Martin Franke, for one, who's on my commission, he looked at me like I was crazy because I was about to go ask LaGrange County. It probably has the lowest population of any county in the basin, almost certainly has the lowest population of any county in the basin. They had been contributing $300 a year to the River Basin Commission. And based on the guidance from the statute, I was about to go ask him for $13,000. And he said, yeah, let me see how that goes. And that was not the only county where that was the concern. But I am proud to say that they're giving us a chance. And it's not set in stone, but this year we've already, so in the past, we got about $10,000 a year in funding from local governments. And a lot of that was from the cities. But we did get $10,000 a year. This year, we're already at fiscal year 18, we're already up to about $45,000 in appropriation from local government, which is really close to the $60,000 goal that we were targeting, and we still got some that I expected. So I'm excited about that. I think we'll have some resources to really do some things. And so if it's not today, at the end of this little talk, or at one of our meetings, we hold quarterly meetings, the commission does. You can find information about when those are on our website. But we'd love to hear from you about how you think the River Basin Commission can be a better resource if we do manage to secure some state funding in addition to this funding that we're getting locally. We may have some resources to help you folks with water management issues. That's the purpose, what we were created for, and I think we're putting ourselves into a position where we'll actually be able to do some more. All right. I want to talk about the biggest thing for me probably over the last 6 months for sure. and that was getting involved in politics, I guess. Not that I had never been involved in it before in some way, but I got a phone call from a state representative in Indiana saying, this was back in December, saying that he was about to introduce a bill that would totally change the scope, the powers, the makeup of the St. Joe River Basin Commission. And he didn't really care much what the St. Joe River Basin Commission thought about it. It was his duty to introduce this bill. And I was very alarmed about this. I felt like I had just got some momentum going. I got a somewhat clear vision of where we're going. And this phone call really pulled the rug out from underneath me. In the end, I think as we'll talk about, it's a good thing, I hope. And one of those was, well, first let me say what this was about. So, I mentioned already, the St. Joe River Basin was unique in that it was created for water quality with its focus. So the other river basin commissions were created for flood mitigation, flood control, or drainage. And this particular state representative was from a part of the basin, Noble County, the West Lakes area of Noble County, that has experienced a lot of flooding problems over the years. Now I know we all experienced a giant flood.
It should stay back, I think.
You don't like that squeal? I don't think it's going to help, Corey. I don't know
No, it's fine. You just can't go too far forward because the speakers are up there.
All right. Let me try this side. So, down in his area, where the state representative is from, water quantity rather than water quality was the main concern when it came to water management. You know, when folks think about what concerns them about water, it wasn't how clean it was how much of it there was, and just way too much. And Noble County is one of these counties, which you can see on that map that I had up there, that is split between the St. Joe. Most of the county drains to the St. Joe River, but there is this little corner of the county that drains to the Maumee River. And the Maumee has its own river basin commission, and their focus is flood control. So the folks in Noble County are very aware of what a river basin commission focused on flood control can do for them. It also helps that they had $3 million in their bank account from the state of Indiana to help with some of these flood mitigation efforts. But they've done some great things. They've developed some data sets. With base flood elevation data, they've also created a comprehensive flood mitigation plan that prioritizes where we need to buy out homes, and then they actually work with FEMA. I use an acronym, but I don't know what that one is. Federal Emergency Management Agency. Yeah. To do buyouts of homes that were built in the floodplain where they never should have been built. So folks, down there are very aware. Hey, the Maumee's helping us with this stuff. Why ain't the St. Joe helping? St. Joe Commission, they both have the same last name. Why isn't it helping? Well, we could always say, well, we were created for water quality, and that's not really what we do. And now, that's not exactly what I said when I went down to Noble County, because I realized there's a connection between these two things. But however, we don't have any resources, and we didn't technically have the statutory authority to work on flood mitigation explicitly. So this state representative said, well, we're going to make you work on flood mitigation. And initially, I think there was a lot of concern among people who had served on the River Basin Commission for a long time, because for those of you who work in watershed management, you can imagine that these two things could be at odds with each other on occasion. Our need to drain the land, get that water out of here, whether it's building levees or building reservoirs, that can have a very negative impact on water quality and natural resources that the commission was sort of established to first address. So there was some concern initially, and we managed to work with the legislators to get some of the scariest language out of there. And I think that the main point that I want to make about this was that the process of going through it, I mean, I think we did end up with a good bill that's not going to hurt us the way I had feared. But I think the important thing was the relationships that were built through the process. I mean, I was down there, I was in their ear, I was talking to these folks, and the number one thing that comes up is, oh great, you've got this responsibility, you've got all this new power, and they gave you no money to do anything with it. That's still on the locals right now. But I feel like we have a really strong case to go down to Indianapolis and say, okay, both sides came together, everybody supported us, unanimous voted for it. We had this giant flood. I mean, the timing of the flood in this legislation was crazy. And so now it's time to step up. And I hope that the relationships we're built will come through in this session when it is a budget year, and hopefully we can get some appropriation from the state to work on developing some of the same resources that the Maumee has done, as well as others that are unique to the St. Joe River Basin. So again, that's that plug to talk to me, talk to these commission members. We've got several commission members here today. Talk to your county commissioners. What is that water management need in your community, because it may be different than what the other community is asking for. And I can guarantee you that Noble County is going to know what they want out of this. The bill came from their part of the region, and so we want to make sure that we're there. Now, for those of you from Michigan, I'm talking a lot of this stuff, and we are talking the Indiana State Legislature, General Assembly. So I hope to envision a future where we can do projects on both sides of the line, but before we can do that, we need to have both sides working together, and hopefully, if we can make this thing sing down here, well, not staying in Indiana now, where I typically stand when I'm talking about this stuff now. If we can make it work in Indiana, I think we've got a reason to go to the Michigan State Legislature and say, we need something like this. We've got an example. We can enter into a partnership, share resources, and let's do this thing. So we really respect natural resource boundaries rather than political boundaries, because when it comes down to it, that's really what we're looking at. We cannot control flooding just working within our county. We're not going to improve water quality and fisheries just working within our county. We've got to work together, and that's what the purpose of the commission is. I hope that it can be that. So the statute change was a big thing for me, and in the end, not only did the language of the bill not particularly scare me, but I think it's consistent that is many of the practices that we've been talking about here at this symposium over the years are all about increasing infiltration and reducing runoff. Well, if you increase infiltration and reduce runoff, if you can stabilize flows, if you can stabilize hydrology, you're going to see improvements both in water quality as well as water quantity. So there is a strategy which we've already been following that I think can make gains in both of these domains. So I think we can still keep charging ahead the way we were and be addressing both things. So I want to give you some examples of some of these. Why I think there's so much opportunity for working together between these two things. And one of the greatest things I get to do as part of this job is talking to people. And I know some of you, the friends in St. Joe, you've heard some of these stories. Actually, some of you have heard all these stories over and over and over. Sorry. I can't help being excited and wanting to talk about it. But one of the things I get to do is talk to kids about this stuff. And this year, I did some work down with the Envirothon in Columbia City, Indiana. But LaGrange, Nova Steuben had kids there. And talked to the kids about soil conservation and water quality and all this kind of stuff. And one of the things that I got to thinking about and talking with the kids was, and I want you guys to do this with me, is to imagine sort of 3 different unique time periods. I think you can probably imagine what time period I'm going for here. Something pre-European settlement, certainly. Pre-large-scale farming, certainly. So think of that as one time period. And then we got somewhere in the middle here, early 1900s. Industrialization, clearing of land, big things happen. This is from Chicago, but I know there's a picture like this at Benton Harbor that's super cool. And the St. Joe River mouth looks, but your image is very similar to this from that time. So, say 100 years ago. That's our middle spot. And then now. Okay, this is the St. Joe looking east into Elkhart County from St. Joe County. And I asked the kids to think about water quality and flooding in each of these time scenarios. Whether they thought water quality had gotten better from here to there, and then from there to there. Had water quality gotten better or worse? Now, does anybody here think water quality got better between here and there? No. I also asked them to think about the same thing with flooding. Did flooding get any better from here to there? Does anybody think we had less flooding 100 years ago than we had then? No. A couple of kids did, which was interesting. I didn't have time to talk to them about it. So what was kind of interesting about this, though, is when we go from here to here, water quality get better or worse from 100 years ago to now? Better. Exactly. How about flooding? Worse. Exactly. And that's what's sort of fascinating, and it comes back to this thing that I've talked about, that many of you hear me talk about before, with the Clean Water Act and this whole idea of watershed management. It's all about how we made huge gains by regulating point sources, these places where terrible things came out of pipes. And we made huge progress there. But what we realized shortly after the Clean Water Act was that we still had a lot of pollution. Our rivers weren't, that little graphic was fishable, swimmable, and drinkable. That's what the Clean Water Act is supposed to protect our water for. Swimmable, drinkable, fishable. We had a long ways to go before we're there. And we realized that what's keeping us from getting there probably isn't the wastewater treatment plants. The guys that run the wastewater treatment plant, they swear to me that the river, or the water coming out of the treatment plant is cleaner than what's in the river itself. So, you know, the only way we're going to make that last step, if we can, or at least make progress towards it, is by reducing polluted runoff. Because that's where most of our pollution is coming from now. It's not from points just running over the land, all land, not just farmland, city land, your lawn, and it's picking up all kinds of stuff along the way and bringing that to the river. And not only is it picking up stuff and bringing it to the river, but it's just coming to the river in a way that it never did. I mean, that's what's so dramatically different between each of these things. The water never made it to the river in this time. I mean, there was a gentleman that spoke here 5 years ago or so, Jim Patchett, Conservation Design Forum, and he said that his biology professor said that prior to European settlement in the Midwest, sorry, Corey, that almost no water made its way to lakes and streams in the Midwest as runoff. It almost all was groundwater seepage. It was coming out from under the ground. The water went into the ground and came back out. Your lakes and rivers were a surface expression of groundwater, essentially, 99% of the year. As we started developing and improving the land, that changed dramatically, right? So, with all that, what it shows is that there's opportunities to address both flooding and our remaining water quality concerns with some of the same strategies. But what are those? And I hope today, because we're going to have a great presentation just before lunch, and I'm hoping to facilitate a little bit of discussion about the kinds of things that we do. We'll touch on some of them even before, but I first wanted to think about this within the St. Joe Basin and sort of tell a tale of two watersheds, if you will. And there are two that I am pretty familiar with. The one that I worked in for a long time is the Paw Paw River watershed up in mostly Van Buren County. And the other is the Elkhart River watershed, which I've been working in a lot since taking this position with the River Basin Commission. And what's unique about them, and why I grabbed them to talk about, is that they both have USGS stream flow gauges on them. So you can go onto the internet and you can find out how much water is coming down the Elkhart River at Goshen, is where their location is, and you can find out how much water is coming down the Paw Paw River at Coloma. And the watershed, the drainage area that comes to each of these gauges is pretty similar. About 600 square miles in this one, 400 square miles in this one. And one of the things that I noticed a long time ago when I was working up in this watershed, I'm kind of a geek about water, and you guys know that. Some of you do, who know me. And so I'll get on this USGS site, and this is great for, I'm not only a water geek, but I'm also a map geek. I really get into maps, and this looks like a lot of the maps that I get excited about. This looks like a mess. You know, what is going on in that map? Well, what that's showing is on each of these gauges across the country, right now, when you log on, and I was on there at 3:30 this morning, working on this presentation. No, it was 4:30. This thing, they hadn't updated yet. So, anyway, I was already done with breakfast by then. So, what those are showing is at each of these locations, how much the flow is either exceeding or behind the average daily flow for that day on record. So they've got the recorded for 50 years what the flow is every day, all day long. They create an average for each day. And depending on how much you go over that, you know how high the river's running. Because every river is different, you wouldn't be able to compare maybe apples to oranges. And it's really cool. I mean, you know, you log in back in February, and these things are all black. They're all just, there's, you know, all the rivers in our region are way off the charts, never been anywhere near that. One of the things I always noticed, this is kind of zoomed in to our region, was back when I was working on the Pawpaw River, so this gauge right here, there would be times when I would log on, and this one would be 1 or 2 shades lighter than all the other ones in the St. Joe River Basin. That, you know, it wasn't responding the same way. And I realized that, you know, the reason that I was up there working on the Pawpaw River was because the state of Michigan had decided that it was worthy of protection-oriented funding. Like, they were going to develop a management plan because they wanted to preserve it rather than just restore it. Now, everybody from up there, you know that Pawpaw has plenty of issues. But the fact was, relative to other rivers in the area, it was in pretty good shape. And USGS stream flow gauges showed that. So I was always kind of curious about it. Well, then when I started working down here in Elkhart, down here, like in Elkhart, sorry. So when I started working more on the Indiana side of the basin, got interested in the stream gauge at Goshen. And it's kind of interesting that this morning they were both, you know, 76th percentile, which is just into the high range. I will note, I'm going to show you the next slide, and this is a snapshot from last summer, just 2 weeks in the summer. And I don't purport that this like actually reinforces what I'm saying, but it just struck me as interesting. And the chances that the rainfall was the same, you know, between here and there, it's not. I mean, there was differences, almost certainly. But if you look at the average flow for last July for both of these, one was 405 cubic feet per second, one was 415 cubic feet per second. So for last July, at least, their flow was very similar. But you look at the pattern in it, and it's very different. You get, this is what's called, you know, the people that are into hydrology and hydrography would call this flashier. You know, it's spiking up and dropping down sharper. And when we see flashy systems, they're generally experiencing more severe flooding and, well, a few things. Generally more severe flooding. Generally the water quality isn't as good. And they also have more trouble with droughts, I would say. But in particular, where we have the evidence of it is within the stream. So a lot of the streams will run dry in the summer, and so you can't maintain spawning habitat in the aquatic organisms summer. So I got to looking at these gauges. I did a snapshot of these and talked about them with some kids at a presentation one time. It got me thinking about the differences in the two watersheds. And I wondered, assuming that the rainfall was the same, what kinds of factors would be influencing that? And for me, the first thing that I thought of as a watershed manager, the first thing was land cover change. You know, that you know, as we transfer from natural forested prairie wetland landscapes into agriculture and then into development, you know, we increase the amount of water that's getting shunted directly to the river. So that was my first thought. And so I went and pulled up the land cover data for these two areas. And if you've seen my maps before, you know these colors and what they mean. But basically everything that's orange in there is agriculture of some kind. What's gray is urbanized and developed. And what's left in green is your forest and prairie land that's left, wetlands. And the amount of natural land that's been converted in the Pawpaw River watershed is only about 52%. Whereas in the Elkhart, we're looking at about 75% of that land that's been converted to higher uses. So that seemed to reinforce what we would expect to see, right? Well, we got to think about that whole land conversion process and what's going on there. And it's important to note that there are tremendous incentives out there to convert land and bring it into production or make it livable. And so this has been a thing for a long time. There's financial gains to be made and food to be grown. There's really important things that we can't do in a forest or we can't do in a wetland. And so over the last 150 years, if not more, we have been very good at converting that landscape to make it usable. I've been talking lately, plumbing the watershed. We've been replumbing the watershed. The watershed already had its own plumbing. It was the creeks and wetlands and all the forests, and we've been replumbing it. And we can do some really great things with our engineering, and many of you in this room know about that. But we have consequences to that too. And it's, so just come along with me for a little bit here. We've been installing a bunch of pipes in the ground, okay? Well, what do those pipes do? What's the other thing that comes to mind of why that change might have been? And it's connected with that land cover change, and that is wetland loss. So part of that land cover change, when you're burying those drainage tiles in the ground, we're draining our wetlands so that we can make them usable. And I have data that I have access to that I was able to calculate, well, how much wetland loss have we had in the two watersheds? Again, pretty dramatically different. The areas in red on these maps is what used to be wetland and no longer is. The area in green is what still is wetland, approximately. And the rate of loss is 70% in the Elkhart versus 46% in the Paul. So these things are all reinforcing this vision, right? But what does that really mean as far as how do we move forward? Because I know that there's some people in this room like, what is he saying? Are you going to go back to, you're just going to go back to the forest then? Like, wait, how's that work? Let's just turn back the time? And there's people out there from the conservation group shaking their head, yeah, that's what we need, We just need fernwood all over the place. But though that, I work for a state agency. I work with local government. That doesn't fly. That's not the goal. That's not the direction we're going. It's not a matter of turn back time. What we'd like to do is make the hydrograph look like it used to, though. Can we make the river and the whole environment, for that matter, function more like it would have, but still be able to grow food, build homes, and live the lives that we want to live? So, the way we did that with water quality was with regulation. At least we talked about here with the Clean Water Act and removing those point sources, how much, impact that had. Well, could we also apply that to make that last step toward water quality, or that start making some difference in flood mitigation through regulation? Could we tell people that they can't build in the floodplain anymore? And wait, maybe we already do. So, but the question is sort of out there as, how do we reclaim some of those ecosystem services, is the fancy word, like the land cover that used to exist attenuated floods. It held water in the landscape. It converted carbon dioxide to oxygen. There's a bunch of functions that it served that we need no matter what kind of lives, whether we're nature people or whether we want to be business, all business. So what I've tended to focus on, so I'm not, and I know that listen to me talk sometimes and it seems like it's just all about back to nature or something. And that's not what we're out there talking about to local government. And I'm not even going here, honestly. I'm not even going necessarily directly at, well, we need to regulate some more. We need some more. We've talked about planning and zoning. There is local home rule and the ability for locals to do things that are stronger than the state level. I love it. And where there is willingness for that, I think there's some real opportunities. But I do know that property rights are a big issue, and you go anywhere near them, and ears start turning off. So what I've been trying to work on, and this comes from my time at the Soil and Water Conservation District, but that's on voluntary measures, and where we can find incentives out there to make our land function and our infrastructure in our built-up areas function more like it would have functioned before without forcing someone to do it. Basically showing them why it makes more sense or more dollars and cents to do it. And it's this concept of trying to, we talk about wetlands being a sponge on the landscape, but really the entire landscape, thinking of how can we hold and soak more water in is the overarching concept to all this stuff. And we've had speakers here at the symposium over the years that have spoke about a number of different things that all get at this. Reducing runoff, promoting infiltration, grabbing more water, thinking of water as a resource rather than a waste product. A couple of them, soil health. We had some folks here from Derek and Amanda from the Indiana Soil Conservation team did a demonstration for those of you who've been coming for years. Really incredible about the difference in soil structure between someone who's minimizing the disturbance and utilizing plants, cover crops is the term, but keeping living roots in the soil at all times. the way the soil behaves is dramatically different from an erosion sort of water quality standpoint, but it also turns out there's some agronomic benefits to these practices. That is, they can make your farm more resilient. They can make you more drought resistant or tolerant of pests, and there's financial benefits to doing these things. So that's the kinds of things we talk about, not just for the nature or for the water quality, but it's because it could be better for your farm. And we've had people come and talk about this. We also had, I mentioned Jim Patchett, people talk about what can people in built-up environments, so this would be like homeowners, what can they do? This is an example over in Elkhart of a rain garden. Rain barrels are another thing you see, but it's the same concept of trying to hold on to water. Don't let it go. Hold on to it. And in this case, I think you typically go looking at an aesthetic benefit. You know, if you want to try and sell this, why would I, as a homeowner, install this? Well, maybe it's because I just think it's the right thing to do, or maybe I think it looks pretty. Where I'd like to see us go is because I could save money on my stormwater fee if I pay one. That would be cool. You know, we'll get there. The other thing we've heard about, and this is fortunate to have examples of this locally, is in our built-up environments in the cities, the municipalities themselves, there's things that can be done. This is an example in the city of South Bend of replacing impervious with pervious pavers so that this parking area can still infiltrate water rather than sending it all to the storm sewer system. And this is an example where we can actually point to not just the water quality benefit, but some savings, some cost savings to the city of taking some of that water out of the treatment plant, so we're not treating it, and putting it in the ground where we want it, so we can use it from our wells, and so we can grow food with it. We're going to hear later today about some really cool things going on in the way of sewer infrastructure that can kind of get at some of these same things, of hold on to that water, don't let it go. I'm hoping we can talk more about this stuff. The last one that I'm going to mention is a speaker that came here. I actually missed it that year, but I know her pretty well. This is Jen Tank. For those of you who don't know, she's a professor at Notre Dame. And this is down in Kosciuszko County, which is one of our counties in the Basin, although this drains the other way. This drains to the Mississippi. It's a chateau ditch. And Notre Dame worked on a project that she spoke about here. And this is an example of how maybe we might manage our agricultural drainage in a way that is potentially more cost-effective, but also better for water quality. And what they did was an experiment where they took a whole drainage watershed and they installed 2-stage ditches throughout the watershed. And then they also got all 70% of the farmers in the watershed to plant cover crops, and they started monitoring it intensively to see what had changed. And it was really dramatic, not just the nutrient numbers, which came down dramatically, the actual amount of flow. It changed the amount of water that was coming through the ditch, which contributes to erosion, which contributes to the need to maintain the ditch. And they saw dramatically lower flows, and her data is still coming in, but it's really encouraging. And like I say, she came and talked about that. So I know that we've got at least one couple of drain folks in the audience today, and I work with these guys a lot, and it's a tough job, and I think there's some real opportunities there for when we start thinking about our public water infrastructure, what we might do around our agricultural drains. So hopefully we can talk more about this stuff later. But it's all, as I mentioned, I feel, the plumbing. We're plumbing our watershed. How do we think about that? We've got plumbing on every single, anybody who owns property in this room, we've got some plumbing on our property. We've probably got some hard surfaces, if nothing else, our roof. Probably a driveway, we got gutters, we're piping water around. We've got septic tanks, maybe a lot of us, and we've got all kinds of plumbing in the land, especially if you expand that view. What I want to focus on as the River Basin Commission is the public plumbing. And what is the public plumbing that we've got out there on the landscape? Who knows what that is? Anybody? Roads. Exactly. I would argue that the roads are probably one of the largest pieces of plumbing we have in the whole watershed. When you think about how much, if you stand outside any kind of rain event around the road, and I mean, obviously we have a lot of storm drains along the roads, but even out in the country where we don't have storm drains, the amount of water that moves over those hard surfaces is incredible. And so our roads themselves are part of our plumbing. And right now, they're not doing much for us in the way of storing water. And I think there's some opportunities there to do them in a way, like the example I gave from City of South Bend, but even with swales and other kinds of fixtures that we can hold on to some of that water instead of losing it. So trying to think about this, and I know some of our engineers here are involved with road projects all the time, and this is an area where we do start to get into some regulation. There is some regulatory around what can be done, but I really think it's a place that we might think about how we do it and doing it better so that we can soak up more water. Who knows what these are? Close, but not. I'm going to zoom in and see if it helps you. That was Steuben County. I wanted to get these for the whole watershed for this presentation, but I wasn't able to. Anybody? Yes, exactly. These are all legal public drains in Steuben County. And I'm telling you, this is not unique. Steuben County is not unique. When I get this data for the whole watershed, it's pretty dramatic. And I've learned a lot, still got a long way to go, about what's all involved in the fact that this thing is a drainage ditch. What does that mean? But at the very least, it means it's part of our public infrastructure. And there's a funding mechanism in place. What is really interesting, these are all the watersheds for each one of those drains. And darn near everybody in Steuben County in the St. Joe River Basin is in one of them. And so when the county has to go out and do work on those drains, either to create them in the first place or to maintain them, just the landowners in that watershed pay for that work. And there's some really interesting things in the state law, both Indiana and Michigan, about how we allocate the cost of that maintenance and creation work. And I think that my drain folks have heard this, and some of you, this is one of those stories you hear a lot, but I really think that there is some opportunity to create incentives for folks to do better, that's not the right word, for folks to store more water on their land so that they can save money and not have the county treat it. You know, same thing you look at in a city. The idea being that if you're not sending water to the county ditch, you shouldn't be paying as much to maintain the county ditch. And the state law supports that. And we've got a drain official here today who was willing to at least give it a try. We've got another one up in Michigan that's trying, and it's encouraging. And there's a lot of hurdles still in the way for it, but the opportunity, I think, is there. And that's the kinds of things that I would like to see the River Basin Commission be able to help the local municipality, local government with, is because the fact is, we can't, as much as we would like, everybody has the right to drain their land, especially if you live in one of these drainage districts. You've even got the right to a certain elevation drainage point, maybe. But there's a cost to that right, and that's not to say anyone wants to take that right away from you, but we have to pay for it somehow. And I think the fact is, if everybody took their right and said, I'm draining it all, our public infrastructure just can't, we can't handle that much water without building levees, basically. We'd have to go out with it. There's nowhere to put it. There's nowhere for it to go. And so the more we can get folks, or the more there's an incentive, I guess, to actually store some on your land, maybe some of that burden can be borne by private landowners rather than just the public, and it brings the cost of managing the infrastructure down for everybody. Okay, just about the last thing here. So the last one is just another example of this for our urban folks. And right now, as far as I know, there's only one county in the basin that has implemented a stormwater fee, and that's Elkhart County. But the idea is our stormwater infrastructure is expensive. And I don't know how it works in every municipality or every county, but where I live in South Bend, the cost for managing that infrastructure comes through my water bill. So depending on how much water I use is what determines roughly how much I pay to manage all the stormwater. Doesn't matter that I've disconnected, actually we do have some incentive now for disconnecting your gutters. But the idea is it has nothing to do with the amount of water I'm sending to the storm drain. It's all about how much water am I taking out of my faucet. And I think there was a time when that made sense, when most of what we were thinking about the water we're treating is the water that goes down the drain. But it turns out so much of the water that we're treating, whether it be physically at the wastewater treatment plant or in our swales or with our valves and all this kind of stuff, is stormwater. It never went down the sink or the bathtub. So when we can create a separate fee structure, and there's a lot of language about, oh, it's not a tax, it's a fee, and there's a whole thing around that. And I don't care what you call it, but what I want to see it be is more like other utilities where it's based on use. And the more we can base that cost on use, the more you have an incentive to turn the light off, to disconnect the gutter, to plant a rain garden so that you don't have to pay. And the county or the township doesn't have to spend as much money managing your stormwater runoff. But if you want to do it, if you want to pave your whole lot, that's your right, and you can do that. But now we, as a local government, we have to do something with that water, so there's going to be a cost to it. And I think a stormwater fee is, first of all, needed, I think, because the fact is water, whether it's water supply, the water that we're getting out of our taps, or whether it's our ability to send water to our agricultural ditches, it's incredibly undervalued. Like, it is so much cheaper than what the actual cost of dealing with this stuff is. And we're just buying time. There's no way that it's sustainable. And so we want to curb that and try and say, okay, how can we promote conservation? That's pretty much what we're talking about, is how can we promote conservation? And I think a stormwater fee helps communities actually raise funds to treat water properly. And by doing it that way, you can transfer some of that onto landowners and empower them to do something about their bill, which is exciting. So the last slide, and I found this last night when I was looking for it, and I put it up there because I think it reinforces this fear that I have about how people perceive me. That it's like, back to nature. That, you know, these cities are terrible, the agricultural fields, it's no good, we gotta, like, you know, plant trees. And it's like, yeah, we do need to plant trees, but it's more about, it's not so much green versus gray. I want to call it as hard versus soft, maybe. You know, the idea is, you know, we can have pervious pavement, we can have all kinds of really fancy engineering systems and strategies, but the idea is to treat water as a resource, to hold on to it and think of it as like, this is what we need. We're so blessed here in the Great Lakes region to have the kind of water, fresh water that we do. And a lot of us take it for granted. And other places in the country are not. And they're eyeing us. And they want our water, I promise you. And if we don't do a good job of managing it, according to federal law, they can get it. So the better job we can do at saying, look, we're managing the water by the Great Lakes Compact, we can hold on to this water and say that it's ours. And there's court cases, I know another one just passed recently where just outside of the Great Lakes Basin, but they're sticking their finger in, you know, the pipe, the straw has been stuck in there. And, you know, if we don't do a good job managing it, that's only going to get worse. So, it's not so much about, it's hard though, because I don't want to sell short. I was down at, some folks here in this room were with me at a stormwater drainage conference down at Purdue University this year. And there was a guy talking about trees as part of stormwater infrastructure. And this idea of green infrastructure, it really is powerful. And so as much as I want to say it's not just about going back to nature, the fact is biology, and the farmers know this about soil health stuff. Biology is amazing stuff. The fact is, when you think of trees as a piece of stormwater infrastructure, for one, the amount of water they can take up it's incredible. And the craziest thing about it is they get better the older they get. Like, what piece of infrastructure could we invest in as a community that starts performing better as it gets older? And it's like, it's the oldest one out there. So, I don't want to sell that short. I am for green things, more biology, more life. But I also don't want to sell short the fact that we need to be able to live here. We need to do things a certain, well, need maybe too strong a word, but we want to do things a certain way. And so can we provide for those things in a way that still captures some of the water savings, the holding on to the water because it's precious. And that's the 2 cents from a water geek. So I'm going to end it with that. I think I've got 5 minutes if anybody has questions.